What would you do if you found out the person you envied your whole life wasn't even who you thought they were, and had been living a double life? She was only 17 when the town realized their angel had been someone else's weapon all along. Seraphina Cole stood in the center of Ravenshore Community Church every Sunday morning, like a living portrait of grace. Honey blonde hair pulled into a loose braid, hands folded just so, eyes downcast in a way that made grown men look away and mothers sigh with envy. She was the kind of girl pastors mentioned in sermons without naming, the kind parents weaponized in whispered comparisons to their own disappointing daughters. But perfection, Seraphina had learned, was just another word for invisible. And invisibility, she discovered, could make you do terrible things just to prove you were real. If stories like this stay with you long after they end, stay close. You'll want to see how deep this goes. Ravenshore clung to the hillside like a scar that refused to fade. A town built on old timber money and older secrets, where everyone knew your name and no one knew your truth. The church sat at its heart, whitewashed and watchful, its steeple casting a shadow that touched every home by sunset. Seraphina's father, Pastor Elijah Cole, had led that church for 23 years. Her mother, Miriam, played piano on Sundays and hosted Bible study on Wednesdays. Together, they were Ravenshore's moral compass, and Seraphina was their true north. At least, that's what people believed. What they didn't see were the nights Seraphina woke with her sheets soaked and her heart hammering, unable to remember falling asleep. The mornings she found dirt under her nails and couldn't recall going outside. The way certain men at church wouldn't meet her eyes anymore, their hands trembling when she walked past. She told herself it was nothing, but nothing doesn't leave bruises shaped like fingerprints you don't remember earning. The first time it happened, the first time she truly noticed something was wrong, she was 14. She'd gone to bed after finishing her homework, her Bible open to Psalms on her nightstand like always. When she woke, it was 3 a.m., and she was standing barefoot in the church cemetery, her nightgown damp with dew, her feet bleeding. From the gravel path, she didn't remember walking. She told her mother she'd been sleepwalking. Miriam had believed her, prayed over her, anointed her forehead with oil, and sang hymns until Seraphina fell back asleep in her own bed. But the sleepwalking didn't stop. It just got better at hiding. It started small. A glance held too long with Brother Thomas, the youth director whose wife taught Sunday school in the next room. A conversation in the church parking lot with Deacon Harris that lasted 15 minutes longer than it should have, both of them leaning against his car like teenagers, his wedding ring catching the streetlight. Then the texts began appearing on her phone, messages she didn't remember sending, conversations that made her stomach turn when she read them back. Words that sounded like her voice but felt like someone else's thoughts.
Meet me after choir practice. Your wife doesn't have to know. I can't stop thinking about you. She deleted them. All of them.
Told herself she'd been hacked, or that someone was playing a sick joke. But the hotel receipts in her coat pocket, receipts dated on nights she'd told her parents she was studying at the library, those were harder to explain away. And the gold chain she found tangled in her hair one morning, engraved with initials that didn't belong to anyone she knew she'd been near. That was impossible to deny. Seraphina started keeping a journal, trying to piece together the gaps in her memory. She'd write down where she went, who she spoke to, what time she went to bed. But whole evenings would vanish from the pages like invisible ink. And in their place would be fragments, a man's cologne on her clothes, lipstick smudged on her collar that wasn't her shade, the taste of whiskey in her mouth, though she'd never touched alcohol in her life. She was terrified, not of what she was doing, but of the fact that she couldn't remember choosing to do any of it. Leora Adeyemi had spent her entire life 3 steps behind Seraphina Cole, and she was tired of breathing her exhaust. At 16, Leora was sharp where Seraphina was soft, outspoken where Seraphina was demure, ambitious where Seraphina was obedient. She earned straight A's and got lectures. Seraphina earned B's and got praise for doing her best. Resentment was a living thing inside Leora's chest, and it fed on every comparison. Every disappointed look from her own mother. Every time someone said,
"Why can't you be more like Seraphina?"
So when Leora noticed Seraphina slipping out of Wednesday night service early, something dark and hungry unfurled in her gut. Finally, she thought. Finally, the mask cracks. She started watching, taking notes, following at a distance.
And what she found made her skin crawl. The first time
Leora saw Seraphina meet Brother Thomas behind the old fellowship hall, she thought maybe it was innocent.
A mentor checking in on a struggling student. But the way his hand lingered on her waist told a different story.
The second time, it was Deacon Harris, leaning too close in his truck, his breath fogging the window.
The third time, it was someone Leora didn't recognize. Older, married, desperate looking. Leora's jealousy curdled into something else. Disgust, maybe. Or fascination. Or both. She started screenshotting the messages she found on Seraphina's unlocked phone during youth group, photographing the receipts she glimpsed in Seraphina's bag, collecting evidence like ammunition. But the more she gathered, the stranger it all seemed, because Seraphina during the day looked haunted. She flinched when people touched her. She stared at her own reflection like she was trying to recognize herself. Leora watched her in the church bathroom, gripping the sink so hard her knuckles went white, whispering to her own reflection. Leora told herself it was an act.
Is Seraphina faking this, or could it be real?
It had to be. Because if it wasn't,
confused.
If Seraphina really didn't know what she was doing, no, that was impossible. If you're still here, you already sense something isn't right. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying it. The night Leora brought the evidence to the church council, the air in the room turned to ice. She laid it all out on the conference table. Printed messages, receipts, photos taken from a distance, timestamps that didn't lie. Elder Morrison's face went grey. Brother Thomas's wife began to weep before anyone said a word. Pastor Elijah Cole sat frozen, his hands flat on the table, staring at the images of his daughter, like they were written in a language he couldn't read. Miriam whispered,
but her voice had no conviction. Leora's chest was tight with vindication and something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like guilt.
But you needed to know.
The council asked her to leave so they could deliberate. Leora waited outside in the hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of raised voices and Miriam's broken sobs through the door. She had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she just felt sick. When they confronted Seraphina, she didn't cry. She didn't rage or defend herself or beg them to understand. She simply sat in the chair they placed her in, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Seraphina, her father said, his voice breaking.
Seraphina, is it true?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't remember. I don't remember doing any of it.
The room erupted. Lies, manipulation, denial. But Seraphina's eyes stayed empty, and that emptiness was more terrifying than any confession could have been. Elder Morrison slammed his hand on the table.
This is unacceptable. A travesty. She must be expelled from this church at once.
She's 17. She's our daughter.
She's a Jezebel.
Brother Thomas spat, and his wife turned to look at him with such venom that he took a step back. Seraphina didn't react.
She just sat there, staring at nothing,
We
her
cannot allow
lips
this to
moving
continue.
soundlessly like she was counting
These are
something no one
delicate
else could see.
matters. Seraphina.
Pastor Cole reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Seraphina," he said gently.
Look at me.
She did. And for just a moment, her eyes flickered, not with recognition, but with something else. Something old, something that didn't belong.
Elijah pulled his hand back, like he'd been burned.
Get Micah Day. Get him now.
Reverend Micah Day arrived in Ravenshore 3 days later, summoned by a desperate phone call from Pastor Cole. He was younger than Leora expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd seen hard labor. He didn't speak in King James pronouncements or wave a Bible like a weapon. He just sat across from Seraphina in the church office and asked her one question.
When did you start losing time?
What?
The blackouts, the gaps, when did they start?
Her eyes filled with tears for the first time.
I was 7, maybe younger. I'd wake up in places I didn't remember going. My parents thought I was sleepwalking.
Micah nodded slowly, something dark and knowing settling over his features. He turned to Pastor Cole.
17 years ago, you performed a deliverance on a woman named Constance Thorne. Do you remember?
Elijah's face went white. The name hit him like a freight train. Constance Thorne, a woman from 2 towns over, brought to him by her desperate family. They said she'd been touched by something dark, something that made her violent and unpredictable. He had prayed over her for hours, commanding the spirit to leave in the name of Christ, and it had left.
I cast you out.
But Constance's heart had stopped moments later.
She died during the session. The spirit you cast out had nowhere to go. It was furious, vengeful. And your daughter was just 3 weeks old, a fragile dreamer, unaware, peacefully resting in the nursery, just a whisper away. It's been inside her ever since, dormant, waiting. And when she hit adolescence, when her body began to change, it woke up.
No, that can't be.
It used your body, your voice, your face to destroy marriages, to humiliate faithful men, to punish your father through you because it couldn't touch him directly.
Seraphina's tears came in waves now, her whole body shaking.
I didn't want to do any of it. I swear I didn't.
Leora, standing in the doorway, felt her knees go weak.
Oh God, what have I done?
The deliverance took 4 hours, and they cleared the church office, leaving only Micah, Pastor Cole, Miriam, and Elder Morrison, the only one with enough experience in spiritual warfare to assist. Seraphina convulsed and screamed in voices that weren't hers, low, guttural, ancient. She begged for forgiveness in languages she'd never learned. She wept for sins she'd never chosen. The entity inside her fought like a caged animal, cursing them in words that made Elder Morrison recoil. Micah never wavered. He spoke with authority and compassion, commanding the spirit to release her in the name of Jesus Christ, over and over, until his voice was hoarse and sweat poured down his face. Leora watched from the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, horror and regret warring in her chest.
This wasn't her fault. None of it was her fault. When it was finally over,
when Seraphina went limp and silent, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, the room felt lighter, cleaner, like something thick and oppressive had finally been torn away. Seraphina opened her eyes,
Thank you, Lord.
and for the first time in years, they were clear. She looked at her father and whispered, Elijah collapsed beside her, pulling her into his arms, and they both sobbed like the world had just begun again.
Recovery was slow. Ravenshore rallied, not with judgment this time, but with guilt-edged compassion. Meals appeared on the Cole's porch. Cards filled their mailbox. The men Seraphina had been used to destroy quietly left town. Their marriages shattered, but their consciences finally awake.
I can change, I promise.
Brother Thomas's wife filed for divorce.
Together.
Deacon Harris resigned from the council. And the whispers that had once condemned Seraphina now turned inward. People asking themselves how they'd missed the signs, how they'd been so quick to judge without asking why. Leora was the first to knock on Seraphina's door after she came home from the hospital.
I'm sorry, I was wrong. About everything.
Seraphina looked at her for a long moment too, not with anger, but with something softer. Understanding, maybe.
You didn't know, no one did. I should have asked. I should have asked if you were okay. Come in. I think we both have a lot to unlearn.
They sat together in the Coles' living room, two girls who'd spent years on opposite sides of an invisible war, and talked until the sun went down. About pressure, about expectations, about what it meant to be seen versus being known. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something that looked like friendship. Months later, Seraphina stood in front of the congregation for the first time since the deliverance. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the pulpit, but her voice was steady.
I spent my whole life being who you needed me to be. The perfect daughter, the golden child, the girl who never made mistakes. And it almost destroyed me.
She paused, letting the words settle.
Not because I was bad, but because I was never allowed to be human. I was lost in your vision of purity, and I overlooked the shadows creeping in.
Her eyes swept across the congregation, landing on faces she'd known her entire life.
So if you see someone who looks perfect, ask them if they are okay, because the battles people fight aren't always visible. Some live in the mind, some live in the spirit, and some.
Elijah nodded, tears streaming down his face. Seraphina took a breath and continued.
I'm not asking for your pity. I'm asking for your humanity. Because if we're not careful, the weight of who we're expected to be will crush us before we ever figure out who we actually are.
When she stepped down, the church was silent. And then, one by one, people began to stand of Hodeth. Not in judgment, but in solidarity.
In acknowledgement. In the painful recognition that they, too,
had worn masks so long they'd forgotten what their own faces looked like underneath. Seraphina walked back to her seat beside her mother, and Miriam took her hand and held it like she was afraid to let go. Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves across the churchyard. And for the first time in 17 years, Seraphina Cole felt like she could finally breathe. Years later, Seraphina would return to that church fugly, not as the perfect daughter, but as a woman who'd learned to carry her scars like badges of survival. She'd speak at youth retreats about identity and spiritual warfare. It is okay to feel overwhelmed. She'd counsel young girls, drowning in expectations they never asked for. And sometimes, late at night, she'd drive past the cemetery where she once woke, barefoot and bleeding. She'd whisper a prayer of gratitude that she survived the war and no one else could see. If this story stayed in your chest, subscribe. The next one might stay even longer. And send this to someone you haven't checked on in a while. It might matter more than you know, because some people aren't hiding who they are.
They're hiding what's been hiding inside them all along. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask someone if the smile they're wearing is really theirs.